Welcome back to your next lesson on prenuptial agreements. There are a lot of couples who do not know what a prenuptial or prenup is or what it protects each person from. So I wanted to dedicate a lesson on this so that you can both make an informed decision in regards to whether you may or may not need one. And if you and your fiance have already discussed this matter and have decided against it, feel free to skip to the next lesson. But if you haven't a clue as to what it is or what it does, stick around and I'll give you the rundown. In this lesson, we will go over what a prenuptial agreement is, if you may or may not need one, reasons people get a prenup, benefits of a prenuptial agreement, disadvantages, what a post-nuptial agreement is, as well as typical costs. Let's start by going over what exactly a prenuptial agreement or prenup really is. First of all, it's important that you understand exactly what a prenup is. A prenup is an agreement made by a couple before they marry concerning the ownership of their respective assets should the marriage fail. So basically, it's a contract that you sign before getting married to figure out finances in the case of a divorce. But do you really need one? Let's start by me asking you a few questions in order to easily determine if you should look into getting a prenuptial agreement or not. Do either of you own your own separate real estate? Do either of you have $50,000 or more in assets like stocks, bonds, or IRAs? Do either of you own a business? Will either of you be going back to school in the near future? Do either of you earn more than $100,000 a year? If you answered yes to any of these questions, you may want to consider a prenuptial agreement. Talking about these what-ifs can shed light on your relationship and your potential need for a prenup. You see, most couples that get married now usually enter the marriage on relatively equal terms. Both spouses are more than likely both working and building their careers prior to getting married. Once you get married and decide to start a family together, usually one of the parents often cuts their workload back to spend more time at home raising the children. When this happens and one spouse decides to put their career on the back burner, it limits the amount of money they can potentially earn and contribute financially by a great deal. Let me give you another example. Now, what would happen if you didn't have a prenuptial agreement and the marriage ended after 7 years and 2 children later? What if the spouse who was working did not want to pay the other alimony? Do you even know what alimony is? And if you don't, alimony means payments for the support and maintenance of a spouse, either by a lump sum or on a continuous basis. Alimony is paid by the supporting spouse to the dependent spouse, and the general rule is that a spouse is dependent when he or she makes less money than the other spouse. And in that case, both spouses may elect to continue working, and instead of one of them staying home and provide alternate child care services like a sitter, nanny, or daycare. It's important to sit down and discuss these issues prior to getting married. This way, both you and your fiance can discuss the issues and decide whether it would benefit you to have it drawn up into a legal contract or not. Remember, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. Reasons people get a prenup. Some of the reasons couples choose to get a prenup include: you have children together, one has more debt than the other, one of you will not be working, to ensure your marriage and finances remain private, to protect your investments, and if one of you have been married before. I should also point out, in case you weren't aware, that some states, including Texas and California, are known as community property states, which means couples' assets are usually divided in half regardless of circumstances. That means couples who wouldn't want an equal division need a prenup to prevent it. Prenups are like an insurance policy. No one likes thinking about either worst-case scenario, but having one in place can ease the stress of a painful life event. So now let's go over some of the benefits of a prenuptial agreement. Prenups can save you any conflict in the case you end up getting divorced because everything has already been agreed upon prior to the marriage itself. Another benefit of a prenup is that it will save you a ton of money in litigation fees during your divorce. If everything was already outlined and agreed upon prior to getting married, there will be no need for both of your lawyers to bill you hourly while you try to come up with an agreement on financial matters and who gets what. Also, if either one of you had any property or assets prior to getting divorced that you wanted to protect or not have to split, in the case of the marriage ending in divorce, a prenup could do that for you. A prenup can also contain any special arrangements made between the two of you in regards to any big financial decisions in the future and how those items would be distributed in the event of a divorce. Now, there's something that a lot of couples tend to forget about, and that is assignment of debt. If one of you were to go back to school and needed to take out student loans, who would financially be responsible for them? You solely, or would the both of you be responsible? What if one of you entered into the marriage with a significant amount of financial debt or loans? Who would be responsible for that debt? Because if you don't have a prenup, typically what happens is, as part of the divorce judgment, the court will divide the couple's debts and assets. The court will indicate which party is responsible for paying which bills while dividing property and money. Generally, the court tries to divide assets and debts equally. However, they can also be used to balance one another. And in community property states, most debts incurred by either spouse during the marriage are owed by the couple, even if only one spouse signed the paperwork for a debt. However, if you have private student loans, your spouse could be responsible for paying your debt as well. Now let's talk about some of the disadvantages to a prenuptial agreement. While it may not be a romantic subject to bring up and discuss, it's a realistic one that needs to be talked about before entering into a marriage. Another disadvantage is that even if you have a prenup, the judge is always able to rule against anything that they may think is unfair in the agreement. One major disadvantage is if you plan on putting anything about the custody of your children in your prenuptial agreement, prenups do not allow any agreements between you and your spouse when it comes to the custody of your children. Prenups also do not include any personal preferences, they only include financial assets. And lastly, each state has different rules regarding prenups. So, if you're thinking about obtaining one, you're going to want to discuss things thoroughly with a family attorney. Postnuptial agreements. You may decide that you do not need a prenuptial agreement at this time if you both have no debt or assets. In this case, you will always have the option to consider a postnuptial agreement, which is an agreement entered into after the marriage. Postnuptial agreements can be created when each spouse is bringing something to the table after being legally married. The legal concept is often referred to as bargained for exchange. Similar to a prenuptial agreement, a postnuptial agreement establishes how the couple's assets will be divided in the event of a divorce or legal separation, and the amount, if any, of spousal support that one spouse will pay to the other if the marriage ends, and for how long. It also will help determine how any marital debt will be divided, like mortgages, loans, credit card debt, and other loans. A spouse could agree to a postnuptial agreement in the exchange for allowing the other spouse to purchase another asset, for example. A postnuptial agreement might make sense if one spouse is deciding to stay home with the children and wants to protect herself financially. While postnuptial agreements can be more difficult to enforce, should you choose to purchase cars, homes, stocks, bonds, or property once you're married, you just may want to consider a postnuptial agreement. Now, as you saw in the beginning of the lesson, divorce can cost over $60,000 without a prenup. And this will mostly depend on how quickly the two of you are able to come to an agreement regarding the splitting of your assets and financial matters. The longer you cannot agree, the more money you'll end up paying in attorney fees and court costs. If you bring to the table before marriage very little debt and a lot of assets, it may be in your best interest to invest the $2,500 to make sure you protect those financial assets in the long run. Now for some tips to remember about prenuptial agreements. First, you should both have your own attorneys. You do not want to go into divorce proceedings with the same attorney. You should discuss this when the time is right. You should both agree before getting married on your assets and divisions of financial assets should something happen and result in divorce. And lastly, make sure you're on the same page when it comes to all of your financial decisions.